Story 1. For the last 5 years, every November 20th, I have received a letter from the state prison. He has never forgotten my birthday. Actually, he has never forgotten anything. He has one of those memories where he can remember everything he has ever seen or read. He is a true genius. Even though I couldn't face visiting him in prison, I still read his letters. For a moment, while reading his neat handwriting, I could forget what he did. For a moment, I could remember him as he was when we were kids, the smartest person I ever knew and my best friend, not the murderer, not the devil. I was only 15 when he was sent away for 2 life sentences. That day is burned in my mind forever. I came home from school and smelled something like iron when I entered the house. I heard my brother sobbing in their bedroom, and I saw my parents' bodies, torn apart beyond recognition. It was the day I became an orphan. He never said a word to defend himself. He never explained why he did it, and I never forgave him. But even though I didn't respond to his letters, he continued to send me a birthday message every year. He often recalled happy memories from our childhood and filled the letters with apologies I didn't want to hear. The first letter arrived a few months after he was locked up. I had moved in with my grandmother after my parents died, and I was having a hard time in school. It was difficult to focus on anything other than what had happened. I had no answers as to why it happened. My brother loved my parents, and they loved him. There was no anger or abuse in our household. Richard was set to go to MIT in the fall. We were happy. But about a month before it happened, Richard's behavior changed. He stopped hanging out with his friends and stayed in his room all the time. He would only come out for meals. Normally, we would play video games or chess together in the evenings, but we hadn't talked for weeks. Also, he was very jumpy, like he could be startled by a butterfly. My parents and I thought he was just nervous about going away to college, but after they died, I wondered if he knew what he was going to do and was working up the courage to do it. Maybe he had always been a monster, or maybe something just snapped. Whatever the case, I hoped he would explain things in his letter since we hadn't spoken since the day he was arrested. But I was disappointed. The letter read, "Happy birthday, Jason. I wish I could be there. It's hard to believe I'll never celebrate another one with you outside of here, and I'm sorry that it has to be like this. There is so much I want to tell you, but for now, all that matters is that you're safe, and I'd rather focus on happier thoughts. I still remember Mum and Dad bringing you home from the hospital. You were so tiny, and I was terrified that I'd drop you. I practiced holding bags of flour in the mirror to hone my technique. You were such a gift to us, so precious, so small, and now you're a fully grown man. 16 is such a fun age. Grandma told me she got you a car. Be careful out there, but also tear it up a little bit. I miss you, but I understand why you have not come to see me. Please know how deeply I regret what happened, and how terrible I feel for the impact their deaths had on you. I don't fault you for your feelings towards me. I would not forgive me either. But I love you, and I always will. Richard." I'm not sure what I expected. Nothing he could have said would have made it all better, but I still felt empty when I finished reading, partly because of the bitterness I felt towards him, and partly because I felt guilty for leaving him in there without saying hello. For 15 years, Richard was my best friend. He protected me from bullies, taught me more than I ever learned in school, and was everything I aspired to be. No matter how much I wanted to hate him, and no matter how horrified I was at what he did, I missed him too. But I was 16, I had friends and a car. It was easier to see him as despicable and deserving of his fate. My grandma quickly learned to stop asking me to visit him in prison. She might have told him to give me some time to come around, or maybe he guessed from my lack of reply that it was best to keep his distance. Either way, I didn't hear from him again until my next birthday. Happy birthday, Jason. Another year has passed. I hope you are well. Prison life is a lot duller than they make it out in the movies. Mostly, I play chess and board games with other men serving life sentences. As none of us have any hope of release, we just whittle away the days waiting for the end. It's tedious, but I'm okay. All I need is to know that you're safe, and you're happy to get me through the long hours. If you can never stomach direct contact, the updates from Grandma will be enough for me, but it would be great to hear from you. I know it's only been a couple of birthdays, but it already feels like ages that we've been apart. I mean, you're 17 already. Soon you'll be graduating. The little boy that used to follow me and my friends around the neighborhood all day is nearing adulthood. You're going to go on to do something incredible, I just know it. You were always the better of the two of us. I love you, Richard. I never understood why he, the smartest person to come out of our small town, thought so highly of me. But he used to say that smarts weren't everything. His brains didn't much matter anymore anyway. All his talents were going to waste. His highest aspiration was likely to become the prison chess champion, and I was doing my best on the outside to get back to some kind of normalcy. 17 was an interesting age for me. I got my first girlfriend, had my first beer. These were things I wished I could share with him, especially once I managed to turn things around in school and improve my grades. I wanted to reach out. I wanted my brother back. But every time I got close, the image of him smiling or laughing was quickly replaced by the image of him covered in blood. And what happened next did not help. 8 months after my 17th birthday, they found Richard's cellmate ripped to pieces. Even though there was a mountain of evidence against him and he had pled guilty to the charges, I had always held on to some doubt that he had actually murdered our parents. Maybe someone else broke in and committed the crime, and my brother was just too traumatized to remember it properly. But after his cellmate's death, it was hard to keep believing in his innocence. There was no denying it now. The same method, the same man left alive afterward, and no one else had access to their cell that night. He was a killer, a cold-blooded killer. I couldn't understand how my grandma continued to visit him, but she always said, "He'll never stop being my grandson." Love is a strange thing. In that same spirit, I couldn't bring myself to throw out his next letter when it inevitably arrived, so instead, I read it. Happy birthday, Jason. I hate to start off with something morbid, but I'm sure you've heard what happened to my cellmate. I don't care what anyone else thinks of me, but I haven't been able to sleep with the burning notion that you may be even more disgusted with me now than you were before. I won't make any excuses or claim there was a mistake. I just want you to know that what happened to him, and what happened to our parents, does not truly reflect who I am. I may be flawed, but I am not an evil person. There's not much more I can say in my defense. Guilty and innocent are relative terms. In any regard, they're going to isolate me from now on, probably for the best. I told them not to put me in a double in the first place. I wish I could take everything back, but as I can't, I only wanted to wish you a happy 18th birthday and congratulate you on getting into your dream college. You killed it despite everything, finished with honors, a huge scholarship. I'm so proud. You being out there and living your best life is what keeps me going. I love you, Richard. Guilty and innocent are relative terms. What a cop-out. Again, he didn't deny his involvement, but he didn't exactly admit to the act either. I found myself furious that he'd effectively described my orphanhood as being due to him being flawed. Flawed? How about sick? How about messed up? Or yeah, how about evil? I couldn't comprehend that with 3 bodies under his belt, horribly mutilated bodies, that he would try to claim that he wasn't an evil person. How the two of us had been raised in the same household under the same tutelage and come out with such wildly different moral compasses baffled me. I didn't want his congratulations or his pride in me. All of my successes over the previous 2 years were my own, despite everything. I just wanted him to go away. I wanted to never hear from him again. That day, I swore I wouldn't open any more of his correspondence, swore I'd have Grandma tell him not to send any more mail. But she wore me down over the next year. She told me that he was not doing well in isolation, looked thinner every time she went up there. I brushed her off until she showed me a photo of the two of them from her most recent trip. He looked like a completely different person. The blue eyes that used to pierce through you were now sunken and dark. His deep brown hair was now flecked with grey, unkempt and thinning. It was hard to believe that the man standing next to Grandma was nearly 60 years her junior. He'd aged enormously. Again, I felt the hollow guilt at refusing to give him even the dimmest hope that he still had a brother that loved and supported him, and, as she told me it was the only thing he was looking forward to, I decided, at least, not to tell her to stop him from writing to me. Away at college when the next letter came in, I received it a day late through the university mail, and I waited until my roommate left me alone before unfolding it on my desk. Happy birthday, Jason. Hopefully I got your new address right. Grandma was pretty sure she gave me the correct dorm room number. There's not much to update on my end. I'd be lying to say it's been great for me, but I'm getting by. I read a lot, and at least the guards treat me relatively well, given what I'm in here for. But today is a good day. Writing to you is the highlight of my year. It always makes me nostalgic for when we were kids. Things were simpler then. Sitting down to pen this, I tried to think of my favorite memory of you, and I landed on when we found Buttons starving in the backyard, a helpless little kitten, and you nursed her back to health. Eventually made her the fattest cat on the block. You were so gentle, so caring, relentless in your efforts to save her. Sounds like she's doing well now, living with Grandma. I'm glad for that. Also, sounds like you're doing incredible in college. I'm glad for that too. Your last year as a teenager. I know your studies are important, but don't forget to let yourself have some fun. I really miss you, bro. It's been torture to spend these years without you. I love you, Richard. It was rich of him to use the term torture, knowing what he'd put others through. But rather than the fury I'd felt reading some of his previous words, I was surprised by my reaction. I began to sob, and sobbing turned into torrents of emotion long overdue for release. It was the cat, the stupid cat, my wonderful, beautiful little baby. If his goal was to drag up a memory that might spark deep repressed feelings of compassion for him, he'd chosen well. He was giving me all the credit, but we'd worked in shifts those first few days to keep Buttons alive, until we were certain she was healthy enough to spend even a minute alone. Now, away at college, and away from her furry little face, I wept lonely tears, missing her, missing my grandma, missing Mum and Dad, missing him. But it was his fault. It was his fault that he was locked up, his fault that Mum and Dad were gone, his fault. My sympathy waned quickly, and I vowed again not to forgive him. For another year, he'd receive only silence from me. Being away at school, Grandma could not hound me as often to display empathy towards him. College was rife with distractions, and before I knew it, another year passed. Another letter was delivered. Happy birthday, Jason. Welcome to your 20s. I'm not sure where to begin this year. Since I wrote last, things have deteriorated. I know I've said in the past that it's okay for you not to write back, and it's okay that you don't visit. But I'd really like to see you, please. You must be so angry with me. You deserve to be. But just one time I want to see your face again, even if there's only hatred in your eyes. Maybe you could come with Grandma. Attached to the dates she plans to visit next year, maybe you can match one of them up with a school break. Please, I need you, Jason. I love you, Richard. Grandma warned me that this one might be different. The only word she could think to describe him anymore was desperate. She was worried about him and wouldn't even send me the most recent photo they took together. It scared me. No matter how I felt about him, I wasn't ready for him to die too. He was the last member of my immediate family, the last tie to my life before. Maybe it had been long enough. Maybe I could put aside my anger to meet his wishes. I checked the dates he provided, but none lined up with my breaks. I didn't feel right writing him a letter after all this time. If I was going to communicate with him, it had to be face to face. For the next year, I planned to visit the prison, but whenever Grandma went, I was busy with schoolwork, finals, or my summer internship. Part of me wasn't trying very hard to rearrange my schedule, the part that was terrified to look him in the eyes. It always seemed like there'd be more time. He was young, I told myself. He wouldn't waste away so easily. Yet on my birthday this year, no letter arrived. It had been delayed before, and I had moved to a new apartment, so I thought maybe it was lost in the mail. But on November 22nd, Grandma got a call from the prison. Richard was dead. He'd hung himself in his cell. They asked her what to do with the body. I was in shock the whole time she talked through the options with me over the phone. It didn't take long for my shock to turn to rage. He'd taken my parents from me, and now he'd left me too. Left without ever explaining, without ever telling me why. I was empty. I didn't care what they did with him. Grandma asked if we should try to get him a plot close to our parents, but I convinced her that was wrong. Him having eternal rest near the people whose lives he'd stolen. It was egregious. I was all for throwing him in the prison graveyard, but Grandma wouldn't have it. I'm not sure the prison would have agreed anyway, given their limited space. Eventually, we decided to bury him in the plot next to hers and Grandpa's as it was available. We informed the prison that we'd take ownership of his body. For the first time since he was incarcerated, I travelled with Grandma to the prison, as there was paperwork we both needed to sign for the funeral home to retrieve his remains. The 2-hour trek through windy mountain roads gave me a new appreciation for my grandmother. For over 5 years, she'd made that drive countless times, alone, just to give a felon a little comfort. I felt the hollow guilt again that I'd always made her do it by herself. But it didn't last long. Soon, it was replaced with curiosity. When they gave us the few possessions he'd kept in his cell, they also handed me a letter. My name was on the front, the correct address too. He'd clearly tried to post it to arrive on my birthday, as usual, but they'd never let it out of the prison. When I asked why they hadn't sent it, They explained that, per standard procedure, it had been opened, and they needed to investigate it further before sending it out. Given my brother's passing, they no longer deemed it necessary to review. Wondering why this letter warranted more study than his previous birthday wishes, I opened it there in the office and understood immediately. It contained no words of apology or happy childhood memories, at least none that could be discerned right away. It contained no words at all. Scribbled on the neatly folded page in my brother's handwriting was a list of number sets, each containing one number followed by a dash and a second number. 1x, 1x, 3x, 1x. It went on and on. At first I had no idea what to make of it. I could see why they'd stopped it. They probably thought he was planning an escape or some other criminal activity using a coded message. They watched me scan the lines for signs of recognition in my eyes, signs that I knew something they didn't. Finding that I was just as confused by it as they were, they shrugged and let us leave. More pissed off than before, I cursed Richard for giving me gibberish as a final birthday wish before he offed himself, thinking his mind might have broken from being in isolation for so long. But while Grandma drove, I opened the letter again and inspected it more closely. The first number before a dash was always 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5, but the second ranged from 1 to over 200. They were clearly references to something, a cipher of some kind, but Richard hadn't provided a key for it. Unless he already had. The letters, 5 previous letters, 5 keys, possibly each number set referred to a word in them. Excitedly, I thought back to each of them and recalled that all 5 started exactly the same way. Happy birthday, Jason. The first set of numbers in his code was 1 to 3. First letter he'd written to me, third word, Jason. Richard may have left me a final message after all, but I would need to wait to decipher the rest of it. Luckily, in a bout of sentimentality, I'd saved everything he'd written to me, but 3 of the letters were at my grandmother's house and 2 were at my apartment in college mixed in with my school things. With helping Grandma get ready for Richard's funeral, I didn't have much time for decoding anyway, and just as well, I thought, as with only the first 3 keys available to me, I could only partially reveal his note. So, I tried my best to forget about it for the time being. I would be heading back to school after we buried him. I could wait a few days while we said farewell to Richard. I'm not sure why we bothered with all the fuss of holding a formal viewing and funeral services. Grandma and I were the only people in attendance. No one else deemed him worthy of their time. It was a strange sight, him lying in a casket. I hadn't seen him, other than in Grandma's photos, since they'd hauled him away after his sentencing. Back then he still had life in his face. They'd done their best to pretty him up, but there wasn't much left of him to work with. The only thing that allowed me to identify him as Richard was a small scar under his right eye from when he wrecked his bike once. Grandma stayed back when I approached him, not ready yet to say her goodbyes, but I was eager to put him behind me. When I stood over his corpse, I expected my hatred to finally bubble over, but I just felt sadness, crushing sadness, thinking about who he could have become, and how he ended up instead. It was tragic. I reached forward and touched his hand, and when I did, I felt something, like a stranger watching me from the shadows, a darkness lurking just out of the corner of my eye. Quickly I pulled my fingers away, assuming my emotions had gotten the better of me in the moment, but a weight remained, oppressive, suffocating. I leapt a foot in the air when Grandma tapped me on the shoulder to ask if I was all right, and I snapped out of it. But the next few days, the feeling of someone standing right behind me persisted at all times. Story 2. It made me really nervous and jumpy. When I got back to school, the first thing I did was find the last 2 letters I needed to understand Richard's final note. I laid out the previous 5 letters next to the new one and started to pick out the words he intended. Line by line, I slowly revealed the message. Jason, I am sorry that I never told you. I need you to believe I did it all for you and Grandma. No one else could know. It was the best way to keep you safe. But now that I'm going to end things, I wanted you to understand. I have not killed anyone, but their deaths are my fault. I made a mistake. My friends and I played with a board. Something attached to me. It started to follow me. I saw it first in the mirror. What reflected was not always my face. Then I saw it in my room. A double, terrible, evil. It tore apart Mum and Dad. It would have come for you too. I had to go to prison to keep it away from you. I tried to make it go away, but I only made it angrier. It killed my cellmate. It is relentless. Starving since they isolated me, it tortures me for release. I do not want to end any more lives. Innocent guards could be next. I must end it. I wanted to say goodbye in person, but I cannot hold it off anymore. Please forgive me. I'm not guilty, but I wish I was. It would be so much simpler. Happy birthday. I love you always. Richard. His intellect never failed to impress me. Over 5 years in there, and if he was to be believed, persecuted by some sort of presence the entire time, yet he still remembered every word of every letter he wrote me. Exactly. I wasn't sure whether I could believe any of it, though, and I was left with more questions than answers. If that was what really happened, why did he go to such lengths to conceal it for all those years? I supposed he thought the punishment he got was the best way to keep it away from everyone, wanted to avoid even a hint at an insanity defense, and maybe he worried that if he told me or Grandma after he was put away that we'd try to get him help, psychiatric or like an exorcism or something, and it could put everyone involved at risk, although I'm not sure they even allow that kind of stuff in prison. There's also a high likelihood that he specifically never said anything to Grandma because he was concerned that it would literally kill her, especially after all the strain he'd already put her through. It's why I never plan to tell her. She has a healthy fear of spirits and a very unhealthy heart. But why bother with encoding his final letter? He knew they'd likely open it before allowing it to leave the prison, and he probably knew that with it being a code, they'd flag it. My leading theory is he thought that if they knew what it said, they would have taken measures to prevent him from ending his life. He couldn't jeopardize the attempt. And even if they hadn't opened it, my guess is he assumed I wouldn't have all 5 of the letters with me at school, and wouldn't be able to decrypt it the day I received it, keeping me from contacting the prison to stop him either. Whatever his reasons for explaining things the way he did, it all struck me again as a way to deflect blame from himself. As his mind eroded in isolation, I wondered if he hadn't created this other in his own head to dissociate himself from his actions. Yet, there was that darkness I felt when I touched him, that weight that still hadn't left me. And this morning, I swore, just for a second, that when I turned away from the mirror, my smiling reflection lingered behind. I've never talked about this before. I'm not even sure why I'm saying it now, but it's been bothering me for years. Maybe someone will believe me, or maybe I just need to say it. This is the truth, as much as I can understand it. When I was 7, my mum died suddenly. She collapsed in the kitchen, and by the time the ambulance came, she was gone. My dad didn't know what to do. He was a big, quiet man who had worked at the same warehouse job for years. After Mum died, he just froze. A few months later, he took my little brother Dallas and me and moved us to a small mining town in West Virginia. He got a new job that kept him away for long hours and left him too tired to talk most nights. The town was very small. It had only a few houses, 1 gas station, and an old school that went from kindergarten to 12th grade. The school smelled like mildew and old chalkboards, and the floors made noise with every step. There were only 2 teachers for my grade, and they were very strict. I would almost have a panic attack if they even looked disappointed in me. The rules were very important at that school. If you didn't follow them, you got a warning. If warnings didn't work, you heard the same threat. Don't make me send you to the goodness room. At first I thought the goodness room was just a story to scare us into behaving, like the boogeyman. The other kids didn't take it seriously, and even joked about it sometimes. One kid said, "The goodness room is just the janitor's closet." Another whispered that they made kids sit in the dark until they cried. No one really knew what it was, and none of us were brave enough to find out. Then Jacob got sent there. Jacob was a noisy kid who always got into trouble. He stole pencils from desks, shouted jokes during class, and talked back to teachers like he didn't care what happened to him. I think we all secretly admired him for that. But one day, he went too far. It was during math class. Mrs. Granger, our teacher, was already annoyed with Jacob for humming loudly while she explained long division. Then he made a smart remark about her perfume, and she snapped. "That's it," she said sharply. "Jacob, you're going to the goodness room." He froze, and for the first time I saw fear in his face. "What? No, I'll stop." 2 men in suits that didn't match our old classroom walked in, grabbed Jacob by the arms and dragged him out. He screamed and kicked, but they didn't stop. The door slammed shut behind them, and the room went silent. None of us spoke for the rest of the day. Jacob didn't come back to class the next day, or the day after that. At first, we thought he was just suspended. He was always in trouble, and a few days at home didn't seem strange. But by the third day, kids started whispering. "What if he's still in the goodness room?" one girl asked during lunch. "No way," the boy replied. "They can't keep you there that long. My cousin got sent once and was back the same day." "What happened to him?" I asked, but the boy just shrugged. The whispers stopped when Jacob finally walked back into class on Friday. At first, we were relieved. He wasn't hurt or crying, but then we got a better look at him. Jacob wasn't the same. He didn't joke or smile like he used to. His face was blank, his eyes dull. He didn't react when Mrs. Granger told him to sit down. At recess, while other kids played, he just sat on a bench, staring straight ahead. A few of us gathered around him, trying to understand what happened. "Where were you?" one girl asked. Jacob glanced at her and muttered, "I was in the goodness room." His voice was flat. "What's that supposed to mean?" I asked. He didn't answer. He pulled his shirt collar up, trying to hide something, but we saw it, a small black number at the base of his neck. "What's that?" another boy asked, pointing. Jacob covered the tattoo with his hand. "Nothing," he mumbled. "Did they do that to you in the goodness room?" I pressed. Jacob froze, then nodded slightly. "I'm not supposed to talk about it," he whispered. "Not about the room, not about my assignment." "Assignment?" I repeated, confused. He didn't explain. He stood up suddenly and walked back to the school building. That night I told my dad everything. We were sitting at the kitchen table. Dallas was upstairs in bed, and the only sound was the refrigerator. I told him about the goodness room, Jacob, and the tattoo. My dad sighed and rubbed his face. He looked very tired. "It's probably just some discipline thing, Emmett," he said. "Some schools scare kids a bit to make them behave." "But Dad—" "Look, I know you're upset, but I need you to focus on yourself, okay? Don't get in trouble, and you won't have to worry about it." I wanted to argue, to make him understand how wrong it felt, but I could tell he wasn't really listening. His job at the mine was hard, and he was doing his best to keep us afloat, so I dropped it. But I couldn't stop thinking about Jacob and his tattoo. In the days that followed, I watched him closely. He never spoke unless a teacher called on him, and even then, his answers were short and robotic. He never played during recess, never smiled, never laughed. It was like someone had flipped a switch in his head and turned off everything that made him unique. That made him Jacob. The worst part was the way the teachers treated him. They didn't scold him or even look annoyed anymore. It was like he'd become their perfect student, the kind they always wanted. The other kids started avoiding him. At first, I thought it was because they didn't want to be around someone so strange, but I realized it was more than that. They were scared, and honestly, so was I. For a little while, things at school went back to normal. Well, as normal as they could get under the circumstances. I kept my head down, stuck to the rules, and tried not to think about the goodness room. But then it happened to Dallas. It started during art. Dallas was in second grade, and his class had been painting something for Thanksgiving. Turkeys, I think. He was always kind of clumsy, and when he got excited, his arms flailed like crazy. One wrong move, and he knocked over a jar of red paint, spilling it all over another kid's project. The teacher, Mrs. Kirkland, lost it. She yelled at Dallas, called him careless, and told him to clean it up. I wasn't there to see it, but one of his classmates told me later that Dallas started crying, apologizing over and over. That didn't stop her. By the end of the day, I was waiting for Dallas at the bus stop like usual, but he didn't show up. Dread welled up inside me as the bus came and went, leaving me standing there alone. I knew something terrible had happened. I ran home as fast as I could, bursting through the door and shouting for Dad. He was already in the kitchen, his face pale and grim. "Where's Dallas?" I asked, breathless. "He's still at school," Dad said quietly. "Why?" Dad hesitated. "The teacher called me. She said he got sent to some room, the goodness room." My eyes widened. "Dad, you have to go get him." "I tried," he said. "I called, but they said it's part of their discipline policy, like after-school detention. They wouldn't let me pick him up early." Dallas didn't come home until after dinner. The instant he walked through the door, I knew something was wrong. His eyes were empty, his shoulders slumped, just like Jacob, and he didn't say a word. I ran up to hug him, but he stepped back like he didn't even recognize me. "Dallas?" I whispered, my voice trembling. He didn't answer. Then I saw it. a small black number tattooed at the base of his neck, just like Jacob's. "What did they do to you?" I choked out. He glanced at me, his face blank, and said, "I'm not supposed to talk about it." Dad tried to get him to eat, to talk, to show some sign of his old self, but Dallas just sat there, staring into space. Finally, Dad slammed his fist on the table and stood up. "That's it," he said. "I'm going to the school." I tried to stop him. "Dad, they won't tell you anything. They'll just—" "I don't care," he shouted, grabbing his coat. "They can't do this to my son." He stormed out, leaving Dallas and me alone in the quiet, dimly lit kitchen. I wanted to cry, to scream, to do something, anything, but all I could do was sit there, staring at my brother, who didn't even seem to realize I was in the room. Dad didn't come back until late that night. When he walked in, I could tell something had happened. His face was pale, his eyes unfocused. He looked like he'd aged 10 years in just a few hours. "Dad?" I asked hesitantly. He didn't answer right away. He just stood there, swaying slightly, like he was trying to remember how to speak. Then he slowly rolled up the sleeve of his shirt. There, on his wrist, was a black tattoo. My blood ran cold. "No," I whispered. What did they do to you?" He looked at me, and for a split second, I thought I saw tears in his eyes. But then his expression shifted, smoothing out into something vacant and unfamiliar. "You need to be a good boy, Emmett," he said, his voice low and hollow. "Do as you're told at school. Don't ask questions." I shook my head, backing away, struggling to hold back tears. "Dad, this isn't you. They did something to you, didn't they?" But he didn't respond. He just turned and walked into his bedroom, leaving me alone with Dallas. For the next few days, it was like living with strangers. Dallas and Dad went about their routines like nothing had happened, but neither of them smiled or laughed. They barely spoke to me unless it was to tell me to behave. I felt like I was losing my mind. Whatever the goodness room was, it wasn't just some disciplinary measure. It was changing people, taking something from them, and I knew it was only a matter of time before I was next, and I wasn't about to sit around and wait for it to happen. For the next few days, I made sure to stay out of trouble at school. I didn't speak unless spoken to. I avoided eye contact, but I was always watching, listening. The teachers had changed now. They didn't yell as often and stopped giving the usual punishments like detentions. The threat of the goodness room was all they needed. If a kid even looked like they might cause trouble, the teacher would stop, give them a cold stare and say, "Do you want to visit the goodness room?" Nobody argued anymore. At home, things got worse. Dad barely spoke to me, and when he did, he only reminded me to be good. Dallas stayed quiet and distant, like a doll going through the motions of being alive. Every time I saw the tattoo on the back of his neck, I felt sick. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to know what was happening. One night, after everyone else had gone to bed, I decided to take matters into my own hands. I packed a flashlight, a screwdriver, and a pocket knife into my school backpack. It wasn't much, but it was all I had. I slipped out the back door and walked to the school. The air was cold and sharp, and the only sounds were my sneakers crunching on the gravel road and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. The school looked even scarier at night. The windows were dark, and the peeling paint on the walls seemed to glow in the moonlight. I hesitated at the entrance, my hand hovering over the doorknob before finally pushing it open. The hallways were silent, the fluorescent lights flickering faintly overhead. I kept my footsteps light, moving toward the back of the school where I had seen Jacob taken that day. Eventually I found it, a heavy metal door at the end of a dim hallway. There was no label on it, just a small keypad. The goodness room. I had no idea what the code was, but I tried the handle anyway. Locked. I crouched down and used the screwdriver to pry open the panel on the side of the keypad. Inside was a mess of wires, and I had no idea what I was doing, but I was ready to break the door down if I needed to. Luckily, it didn't come to that. After a few minutes of messing with the wires, the lock gave a soft click, and the door creaked open. The smell hit me immediately, the scent of antiseptic and iron, like blood. I shined my flashlight into the room and my breath caught. Whatever the place was, it wasn't a janitor's closet. The room was small and clean, with stark white walls. In the center, a single metal chair was bolted to the floor, with straps hanging loosely from the armrests and footrests. Above it, there was a mechanical arm with a needle-like tool. Nearby, a table held a variety of surgical instruments I didn't recognize. On the far wall, a monitor displayed a list of names and numbers, many of them crossed out. I saw Jacob's name there, Dallas is too. I felt like I was going to throw up. What are you doing here? The voice startled me so badly that I almost dropped my flashlight. I turned to see one of the teachers, Mr. Keller, standing in the doorway. His face was partly hidden by shadows, but I could see the anger in his eyes. I just wanted to see, I stammered. You shouldn't have come here, he said, stepping into the room. Behind him, 2 men in suits appeared. Before I could run, they grabbed me, dragging me toward the chair. I screamed and kicked, but they were too strong. They strapped me in, tightening the restraints around my wrists and ankles until I couldn't move. The needle on the mechanical arm began to glow faintly, and the arm moved toward me. No, I yelled, struggling against the straps. Let me go! But they didn't listen. One of the men pressed a button, and the needle lowered toward the base of my neck. I felt a sharp sting, like the prick of a bee, and then the strap on my right wrist snapped. I didn't think. I acted. I yanked my arm free and grabbed the needle, pulling it away before it could go any deeper. One of the men lunged at me, but I swung the flashlight, hitting him square in the face, and he stumbled back, clutching his nose. I freed my other hand and tore off the ankle straps, scrambling out of the chair as fast as I could. The men shouted, but I didn't stop. I ran past them, out into the hallway, and through the front doors. The cold air hit me, but I never stopped, not once. I didn't even look back. I ran until my legs burned and my lungs ached. Soon the school disappeared behind me, replaced by fields and dark woods. I kept going, driven by pure adrenaline and the thought that if I slowed down, they'd catch me. Eventually, headlights appeared in the distance. A car. No, a police cruiser. I stumbled into the road, waving my arms frantically. The cruiser slowed, and the officer inside stepped out, shining a flashlight on me. "Kid, what happened to you?" he asked. I tried to answer, but all I could do was gasp for air. "It's okay," the officer said, guiding me into the car. "You're safe now." But I didn't feel safe. Not yet. Not while the goodness room still existed. The officer drove me toward my house, and for the first time that night, I allowed myself to believe I might be okay. The adrenaline was fading, and exhaustion was winning out. My head rested against the cool window as the cruiser rumbled over the gravel road. When we turned onto my street, though, my heart dropped. Red and orange flames lit up the sky above my house. No, I thought, it couldn't be. My house was on fire. Fire trucks were already there, trying to put out the fire. Smoke rose into the air, and neighbors stood outside, watching the scene. The officer slammed on the brakes and jumped out of the car. I followed, my legs shaking as I stumbled toward the crowd. "No," I whispered, the word catching in my throat. One of the firefighters tried to stop me. "Kid, stay back, you can't." "My family's in there," I screamed, trying to push past him. He grabbed me, holding me back. "It's too late. We're still putting it out, but no one's coming out of that. I'm so sorry." I stopped struggling, my knees buckling beneath me. The heat from the flames felt like it was crawling over my skin. Dallas, Dad, gone, everybody gone. I sat on the curb while the fire burned. The officer tried to ask me questions about what had happened and where I had been, but I couldn't speak. My throat hurt, and my world felt broken. I just stared at the house, the home I had shared with my family as it burned down. When the flames finally died down, they found 2 bodies. The coroner carefully wrapped them up. I didn't need to see them to know who they were. My dad, my brother, dead. The police later said it was an electrical fire, likely caused by faulty wiring. They called it a tragic accident, but I knew better. I overheard one of the investigators talking about the bodies. They were burned so badly that there was almost nothing left to identify them. The tattoos they had, the ones I had seen, were gone. Along with them, any hope of proving what had happened to them was also gone. It felt planned. Someone wanted to erase my family, to make sure there was no evidence linking their deaths to the school, to the goodness room. The next few weeks were a blur. Social workers came and went, offering me condolences and promises they couldn't keep. I was sent to live with a foster family in another town, far away from the school. I tried to tell the police about the goodness room, about what the school was doing, but no one really believed me. "The goodness room?" one officer asked, raising an eyebrow. "Are you sure it wasn't just some detention program?" "They tattooed them," I insisted, my voice shaking. "They did something to them in there, something awful. My dad, he wasn't the same anymore, not after what they did to him. But they just gave me those pitying looks, the kind adults give when they think a kid's struggling to cope with trauma." When it became clear I wasn't going to take no for an answer, they finally agreed to talk to the school staff. The staff denied everything. "The goodness room isn't real," the principal said, shaking her head. "It's like an urban legend, something the kids made up to scare each other." The teachers backed her up. They claimed Jacob, Dallas, and I were troublemakers who exaggerated things. Speaking of Jacob, I tried to find his family, but they were gone, moved away. According to the neighbors, no forwarding address, no phone number. It was like they had vanished. I didn't know what to think anymore. Decades later, I still don't understand what happened. Was the goodness room some kind of experiment, or a punishment, or something worse? I'll never forget the look in my dad's eyes when he came home that night, or the way Dallas had changed, replaced by someone who looked like my brother, but wasn't. I've kept quiet over the years, and I've put a lot of distance between myself and the school. Sometimes, though, I wonder if the teachers, the principal, and the men in suits are still out there, waiting to finish what they started. I worry that even after all this time, they're just waiting for me to mess up, to stop behaving myself, and that I'll wake up to find myself back in that room with a number on my neck. If you've ever been to a school like mine, or heard whispers from your neighbors, or God forbid, your own children, about a place like the goodness room, please, I'm begging you, run. Get as far away as you can, and do it now, before it's too late. Because whatever it is, it doesn't just punish you. It takes something, and once it does, you never get it back. Story 3. I am a 35-year-old man, and I was married to Lena, who was 34, for 10 years. If someone had told me years ago that I would end up marrying Lena's older sister, Riley, I would not have believed them. Let's start from the beginning. Lena, who I always think of as my true wife, died from pancreatic cancer. That was the start of my nightmare. The second chapter of my sadness began just 2 weekends ago. It was an evening when I asked Riley, was she telling the truth? About what? Riley replied. I was standing in the front room of Macy Manor, looking at the snow falling outside the window, turning everything white. Riley was sitting in her father's old armchair near the fireplace, holding a glass of brandy loosely in her fingers. She was deep in thought, just like me. When Mr. and Mrs. Macy died in 2005, Riley inherited the grand Edwardian house and became Lena's guardian. Soon after, Lena, who was my childhood friend, told me a big secret. Lena said that you and she could see the spirits of your parents, I finally said to Riley. Riley looked at the other side of the room, and I followed her gaze. There was an empty armchair, but it had a shadow on it. The flames in the fireplace were casting moving shadows all around the room, but that one shadow stayed still. Riley whispered, 100 years ago, Ernest Macy built this house over a dark hole in the ground. In his diary, he wrote that no one should ever enter the hole because it affected him badly, but it also gave the Macy family the ability to see the ghosts of their loved ones. Of course, this gift will end with me. I'm the last Macy, and I won't have children. Lena never told me about a magical hole in the ground, I said, trying not to laugh. Because you always have that annoying grin on your face, Artie, Riley replied with a smirk, tapping a dusty, leather-bound book on the coffee table with her foot. This is Ernest's diary. I think that book has been there since I first visited your home, I said. I've always respected your family's beliefs, Riley, but I've never seen any ghosts in this house. Well, you're not a Macy, she replied. I nodded and pressed my hand against Lena's engagement ring in my pocket. No, not quite. Riley kept looking at the empty armchair, which seemed to have a heavy shadow on it, and she said coldly, Lena wants to show you the best way she can show a non-Macy that she's here. Without thinking, I immediately said, I want to believe. Lena, if you hear... The empty armchair interrupted me. It flew up and flipped over, hitting the white ceiling and sticking there for a moment. I yelled, just like any normal person would. My whole body tensed up. Then the chair fell to the floor with a thud, kicking up dust. After a long silence, I managed to say, I've felt her in this house ever since she passed. The dead never really leave this place, said Riley, so grief is different for a Macy. Even for you, Artie, you're as good as family. What if I had been a Macy? I asked, tears filling my eyes. What if I'd married Lena and taken her last name? She nodded. My mother married into the family and she saw the faces of the dead. Then I said something shocking. We should marry. You and me. That way, I'll be able to see her too. I expected Riley to laugh or protest when she realized I was serious, but she seemed to understand right away. Maybe she had already thought about it. "Let's not go there, Artie," she warned. I looked at the overturned armchair, addressing the shadow I knew was my wife. "Lena, it would only be a marriage on paper." "I'm not refusing on her behalf," Riley explained. "And you'd need to do more than legally change your last name. We would need to consummate the marriage, Artie." "Oh," I said meekly, and the flipped chair made a disapproving creak. "Oh," Riley repeated, laughing. "If only you could see the face your wife is making." I fell silent, and Riley went up to bed a few minutes later. I stayed up all night, reading Ernest's diary. Lena was reading with me, and I felt her excitement as we read a section titled "The Plea of Two." A gust of wind turned a page, the page that said, "To bring a loved one back to physical form, the ritual must be performed by 2 living members of the Macy family." I felt my wife's desire for a second chance at life. If she hadn't wanted it, I wouldn't have pushed it. I woke Riley at 4 in the morning and explained. She argued with Lena about the ethics, not so much about marrying and sleeping with her late sister's husband, but about bringing the dead back to life. Lena and I should have listened, but we didn't, and after only 10 minutes, Riley was convinced to end our grief. "If we don't try, I'll always regret it." My jaw dropped. "Does that mean—" "Vegas is the quick option," Riley interrupted, "and we'll consummate the marriage quickly. No lights, no talking." I nodded, crying with joy as I looked at the shadowy corner where I knew Lena was. A few days later, after we got our travel documents, Riley and I flew to Vegas. We got married and consummated the marriage in a dark hotel room for less than 10 seconds. It was the greatest shame of our lives. Then we had a long, silent flight back to England. A week after we made our plan, we went back to Macy Manor. We drove along the long driveway on a night that was even darker and snowier than the night when we decided to do this unnatural thing. When we stepped inside the house, all the discomfort and regret disappeared, because there she was. Lena, with her blonde hair and wearing her blue dungarees, was standing on the main staircase. She looked like a bright light, almost blinding, watching me. We ran towards each other, crying and telling each other how much we loved each other. But our tears flowed even more because when we tried to hug, our arms went right through each other. We couldn't touch, but I reminded myself that Riley and I did this for a reason. We wanted to bring Lena back. Lena's ghost stood in the doorway of the front room, while Riley and I, holding hands, followed the instructions from Ernest's diary. We recited the plea of 2, begging a dark force to bring Lena back in a physical form. We asked the dark hole in the basement, which we were not supposed to look at, to help us. I wondered if every Macy family member had obeyed Ernest's rule not to go into the hole. Surely, in 100 years, someone had gone down there. My thoughts were interrupted when the bulky diary slammed shut with a force that shook the whole house. Riley and I gasped and turned to the doorway, then gasped again. Lena's ghost wasn't there anymore. Then we heard a creak from the entryway. Without thinking about my safety, I tiptoed to the lobby and looked around the doorframe. I saw the basement door was open, which I had never seen open in all the 20 years I'd been visiting Macy Manor. Through the slight gap, in the darkness of the basement stairs, I saw a pair of blue eyes glowing faintly. They were not see-through this time. I recognized them immediately. "Lena!" I shouted, feeling even more joyful than our first reunion. "Artie," Riley began, her voice full of uncertainty and fear. I barely noticed her. I was focused only on Lena's eyes. I reached for the door handle, not even thinking it was strange that Lena's eyes disappeared into the darkness as I opened the door. I followed quickly, running down the wooden steps into the dark, forbidden part of the manor. I ignored the awful smell that didn't belong to this world. Riley was right. Grief is different for a Macy. The moonlight shone through a small window, revealing a black hole in the basement floor. An old wooden door lay open, showing that Ernest had kept the hole locked. But I didn't care about that. The moonlight also revealed Lena. It felt like a dream. I floated, maybe literally, towards her. When our lips met, the vision started to turn sour. A feeling of terror that had been bubbling inside me finally surfaced. A warm, black substance filled my mouth, violating my senses. When I opened my eyes, I screamed, but my scream was muffled by her mouth. Her eyes, once brown, were now a consuming black. Her strong fingers dug into my upper arms, stopping me from escaping. She started to step backward into the hole, taking me with her. It had all been a lie. The plea of 2 wasn't going to bring Lena back. It brought something else out of the hole, I feared what other lies the darkness had told Ernest Macy and what other scary rituals he might have done. I heard footsteps on the stairs and saw Riley in the demon's black eyes. She came close to reaching me before the creature threw her against the basement wall. My toes began to slip into the dark hole, and I felt a chill beyond any coldness a human could feel. I prayed for an end because I knew surviving in that dark place would be a horrible nightmare. Suddenly, I felt the creature let go of me. I fell backward onto the basement floor. When I opened my eyes, I saw something both terrible and beautiful. White hands, bright in the dim basement, were tangled in the false Lena's hair. The hands were pushing the creature back into the hole. The ghost of the true Lena, with steel shackles binding her to the darkness below, appeared behind the creature, pushing it down. "I love you," she mouthed tearfully. I reached out helplessly as Lena and the creature vanished into the hole. Then the wooden trapdoor swung shut. For days I have felt an even deeper sadness than before. It's worse because I can't move on. Riley was right all along. I don't eat. I don't sleep. I just sit in the front room, looking at the many dead faces of the Macy family. But there is only one face I hope to see, even if it makes me feel worse. If Lena doesn't come back soon, I will find a way to bring her back. Story 4. I always believed that we needed to let go of the ones we've lost, no matter how much it hurts, but no one ever warned me about what to do if they came back. Suddenly, grief, pain, and sorrow, things I was so sure were real, started to feel like lies. When I was 7, my dad died. Back then, I didn't really understand how much he meant to me. I can still remember his last days in the hospital, the strong smell of antiseptic, the quiet voices of the nurses, and his final words, which were clear even though he was weak. "Take care of your mother for me, buddy." After they took him away, I saw Mum on her knees in the hallway after talking to the doctors. It was strange to see an adult break down like that. Life became a blur after his death. Mum fell apart, and I had to learn to take care of myself. I started cooking, doing homework, and handling childhood problems on my own. Some nights I would find Mum in Dad's old chair, still wearing her work clothes, staring at his photo. She would kiss me goodnight, her tears touching my forehead as she made excuses about dust. Growing up without him was hard, but we managed. The years went by, and we got used to our new life. I kept his memory alive in small ways, wearing his broken watch and using his old things. Mum said that grief does that, but she never explained why. Maybe we were both still trying to understand it. As I got older, my memories of him started to fade. I couldn't even remember if his eyes were brown or hazel. Mum kept his photos, but they never seemed to capture him just right. I held onto those photos as a reminder of him. Then, one day in my sophomore year, everything changed. I was walking home on a cool autumn day when a familiar smell stopped me. Applewood smoke, even though no one on our street had a fireplace anymore. At the corner, our house looked different. It felt like time had gone backward. Dad's bluebells were blooming in the dead garden, spring flowers in autumn, and his wind chimes were making music, even though there was no wind. The scent of fresh coffee and pancakes hit me as I opened the front door. We hadn't had coffee made in our house for years. From the living room, I heard a sound I had almost forgotten. Mom's real laughter, mixed with a deeper voice that made my heart skip a beat. The hallway felt like it stretched on forever. Dad's cardigan was hanging on the banister, warm to the touch. His crossword puzzle was on the table, unfinished, with the pen still warm. His shoes were right where he always left them. Every detail was perfect, which made it even scarier. In the living room, Mom was curled up next to him on the couch. My father was sitting there, impossibly real. He had his reading glasses on, that wild eyebrow, and even the coffee stain on his shirt that Mum always scolded him about. "Welcome home, buddy," he said. Mum smiled beside him, holding his hand and looking younger than she had in years. It was like the weight of grief had melted away. She looked at him the way she used to, like he was her whole world. "Dad," I whispered, my voice shaking from the shock of what I was seeing. He smiled at me with that slightly crooked incisor he'd chipped playing baseball when he was 12. "I missed you so much," he said, his voice trembling with emotion, just like it used to when he was trying not to cry. Mum announced that dinner was ready, as casually as if nothing had happened. The smell of his favorite meatloaf drifted from the kitchen, the recipe his mother had passed down, the one Mum had never quite mastered, but now it smelled perfect. I couldn't move. I remembered holding my father's cold hand at the funeral. I remembered watching them lower his casket into the ground. I remembered 9 years of grieving, of missing him, of learning to live without him. And here he was, impossible but real. I backed into the door. "How are you here?" My voice cracked. Dad's face changed to a concerned expression as he stepped forward, hands open, just like he used to when I threw tantrums as a child. "What's wrong, buddy?" His voice had that perfect mix of worry and love I had struggled to remember. Mum appeared, wiping her hands on her anniversary apron, the one that should have been yellowed with age but looked brand new. I kept my distance, the door my only connection to reality. Everything felt real, and that was the problem. I looked at my mother, really looked at her. She looked happy, truly happy, in a way I hadn't seen since before the hospital. I wanted to run, to escape, but I couldn't leave her there with whatever this was. Even if it felt like Dad, even if it smiled like him and moved like him and remembered everything perfectly. I lunged forward and grabbed her hand. "Mom, we have to go," I said, pulling her toward the door. She resisted, her eyes filling with tears. "Honey, what's gotten into you?" Her voice broke just like it used to when I disappointed her. "Why are you trying to ruin this? We're finally whole again." I dragged her outside, past the garden where those impossible bluebells were blooming. The street was empty except for the glow from neighbors' windows. Mum fought against me, repeating, "It's okay," over and over. When I looked back, my father, or whatever looked like him, stood in our doorway, watching us with that familiar hurt expression. "Mum, please," I begged. "He died. You remember the funeral. You remember everything after." But my words seemed to confuse her. "What are you talking about? Your father's right there. He's always been here." She touched my forehead, checking for a fever. "Are you feeling okay? You've been working so hard at school lately." "No. He's dead. Mom, he's dead." The words felt less certain now, seeing him there in the doorway, looking exactly like a father should when worried about his child. Everything I remembered about the funeral started to blur, like a dream fading in the morning light. His footsteps on the path carried that familiar, uneven sound from his old injury. "Come on, buddy. Let's go home. Whatever's bothering you, we can figure it out together. We always do," he said. As his footsteps got closer, something in my mind started to change. Slowly, each memory of my father began adjusting to accept this new reality. "Son," he said, and his voice carried all the warmth I'd been missing for 9 years. "He's dead," I whispered. But even as I said it, I noticed Mum's expression. Patient, waiting, like she knew exactly what I was going through, like she'd made this choice before. But I couldn't accept this. I wouldn't disrespect my father's memory, the hardship we'd faced, the pain we'd endured. "Please, Mum, wake up. This isn't real," I said as I tried to pull her, but this time I couldn't move. No, the truth was I wouldn't move, my body betraying me. "Your father's been worried about you," she said softly. Her eyes met mine, and for a moment, just a moment, I saw everything there. Understanding, grief, choice. "Sometimes," she added carefully, "happiness is right in front of us if we just let it be." He was closer now, and I could smell his aftershave, the same brand I'd kept unopened in my drawer for years. Yet the memory felt uncertain now, like trying to hold on to water. I tried to remember the funeral, but the images kept shifting, then fading. "Do you remember how he used to push you on the swings?" Mum asked, her voice gentle. "How he never pushed too high because you were scared of heights." "Every Sunday," Dad added, and suddenly I could see it clearly. The creak of the swing set, his hands steady on my back, my laughter carrying across the yard. Had that happened before or after? Did it matter anymore? I looked at him, really looked. He wasn't perfect. There were new wrinkles around his eyes that my memories hadn't included. His hair was slightly grayer than in the photos. He looked lived in, real, like he'd been aging alongside us all this time. "Dad," I said again, but this time it wasn't a question born of fear. Something in my mind whispered that this was wrong, that there was another set of memories trying to claim space. Cold hands, a casket, years of absence. But those memories felt distant now, like a dream I'd once had. This felt real, his smile, Mum's hand in mine, the smell of dinner waiting at home. "Come on, buddy," he said, holding out his hand. "Your Mum's lasagna is getting cold." I looked at Mum one last time. There was something in her eyes, Knowledge, maybe, or understanding. A tiny nod, so slight I might have imagined it. A choice being offered. I took his hand. It was warm. That night, my reflection caught my eye, something questioning in my gaze. Then Dad called about tomorrow's fishing trip, the one we'd planned for weeks, the one we'd always done, every year, forever, and I let the doubt slip away. After all, why question happiness? Dad's home. He's always been home. And if sometimes late at night I remember another life, well, that's just a bad dream. Mum says they fade, don't they?